Welcome, everyone. Thanks, Geisha, to the opening panel of this year's Forum State of the World Disorder. I'm David Herszenhorn, Chief Brussels Correspondent for Politico Europe, but joining you today from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the rain seems to have chased me all the way from Belgium. Good morning to those of you joining us here in the US, and good afternoon to all of our friends in Europe. And I'd like to start by thanking, of course, Alina Polyakova and her entire team at the Center for European Policy Analysis. CEPA, of course, is devoted to promoting close ties and enduring ties between Europe and the US. And at Politico Europe, we believe one of the most important of those enduring ties is the unwavering commitment to media freedom. And when Politico decided to go global, its first stop was Brussels, where we've been hard at work creating a unique pan-European and transatlantic media space. So please do read us at politico.eu. I'll make some quick introductions right now, and then we'll jump into our conversation today. I'm joined by H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor, now Fouad and Michel Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, by Bobo Lo, Senior Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Director for Europe and Eurasia at the Open Society Foundations. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. We'll start right quick with General McMaster to talk about the role of the U.S. in the world at the moment. I know you have talked about Afghanistan as a humanitarian catastrophe. Also, it's viewed certainly in Europe now as a failure on multiple fronts, a failure of intelligence, a policy failure, a failure of military planning. That has really shaken confidence, especially among European allies. In recent days, EU leaders have made clear they view Joe Biden not as starkly in contrast with Donald Trump, as the current White House might hope, but rather as a pattern that began with George W. Bush, an instinct toward unilateralism in Washington, a penchant for making a bit of a mess of things in the global arena, an essential question: can the US still claim to be the leader of the free world, a trusted ally, the sole superpower willing to act as a guarantor of democratic freedoms, or has American credibility eroded to the point that Washington is no longer the center of gravity in world affairs? Is there a world order in 2021? General Professor McMaster, take it away.
Well, David, hey, thanks. It's great to be here. Great to be part of anything that CEPA does. And I just want to thank the whole CEPA team for the great work that they do. Alina, I mean, I really think the world needs CEPA more than ever. I would just say that what's the alternative, David? You know, what's the alternative? You know, I think the way that you framed the question is indicative of this, this concept of strategic narcissism, our tendency to define the world only in relation to us, and then assume that what we do or decide not to do is decisive toward the outcome. You know, others have agency. You know, others have authorship over the future, and those others include brutal enemies, as well as adversaries and rivals internationally. So I think it's time really for all of us to take stock, because what we see in Afghanistan is a failure, I think, primarily of will, right? A failure of will, you know, across all of humanity, right? To confront the enemies of all civilized peoples, and because of our self-referential nature, right, this tendency towards strategic narcissism, we have vacated critical competitive spaces under the belief that if we disengage, everything will be okay. And what you see in Afghanistan, I think, is really self-defeat, you know, based on self-delusion, right? And just think about the assumptions that underpinned the precipitous withdrawal and essentially really a surrender to a jihadist terrorist organization. The first of these assumptions, I think, is that the Taliban would put in some sort of more benign form of Sharia, right? And we actually conjured up the enemy in Afghanistan that we would prefer rather than the actual enemy that we were fighting. Second is related to that is that the Taliban is separate, right, from other jihadist terrorist organizations, including Al Qaeda, which of course is not the case. They're utterly intertwined. I mean, Siraj Haqqani is now in charge of security in Afghanistan. And I think the third, and what is probably most important among these assumptions, is that when you lose wars, there's no consequence. So as we're watching the humanitarian catastrophe, you know, the political catastrophe associated with really our reputation, not only the United States, but I think the Western world's reputation, and the security catastrophe, which is just now beginning in terms of the strengthening of jihadist terrorist organizations. You have to ask the question, what do we do? Well, I think we first of all have to recognize the competitive nature of foreign policy, of international security and war. And I think what we've done is we've relearned, the lesson that lost wars have consequences. And really in the United States, across really 3 administrations, we had 3 leaders in a row tell the American people, hey, it's not worth it. Really, we just need to disengage from Afghanistan. So I think we ought to remember what G.K. Chesterton said about war, is a war may not be the best way of settling differences, but it might be the only way to ensure they're not settled for you. And so I think we really need to examine really the sources of will, and to hold our leaders accountable for what is only the beginning of a humanitarian, a political, and a security catastrophe in Afghanistan.
Thanks so much. Some very sobering thoughts there. And with Europe talking so much about the need for strategic autonomy, maybe on the U.S. side, you're suggesting a need to talk about strategic humility to counter that narcissism that you talk about. Let's turn to Bobo Lo. You've been thinking and talking about the world disorder for quite some time. It's not a new world disorder for you by any means. And I want to challenge you a little bit by coming at this from a different perspective, which is on other fronts. Haven't we seen actually this chaotic, disordered world on the pandemic, for instance, come together and find ways to manage a health crisis, not perfectly by any means, but certainly better than has been seen across human history, finding ways to mitigate the loss of life? Are we in fact seeing Europe step up, for example, with exports of vaccines, the effort to coordinate donations to other countries? Again, not perfect, but is there now some glimmer of hope in all this, that there is some new order coming following the disorder that you've described, where Russia and China are sort of exploiting missteps by the US or wherever there's a vacuum to gain benefit for themselves? Take it away.
Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I think we have belatedly seen some level of multilateral cooperation in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Because what global challenges like coronavirus, climate change, what they show is that these are universal problems. These are problems that transcend national and ideological boundaries. So they are collective problems, and therefore they require collective solutions. And indeed, that's been demonstrated by the effective development of vaccines. However, I also think that COVID-19 has brought out the worst in many countries. It has demonstrated for more than 18 months, I would argue, that most governments operate according to narrow self-interest rather than universal norms. So I think we have a bit of a contradictory picture here. The problem is collective, the problem is global. We need to address it collectively and globally. And yet that is not what has happened in many cases. Now, I just want to sort of jump from there to thinking about understanding what I mean by global disorder. Of course, we've had chaos and wars and anarchy in the past. But I think in the past, we have actually had some form of order. Of course, this order was imperfect, but there was some kind of order. I think the world today is more chaotic and anarchic and disorderly than at any time since the late 18th century. And what do I mean by that? What defines a global disorder? Well, I think first, there is a lack of agreement and clarity over the rules of the international system. And therefore, we have rules breaking on a serial scale. It's unclear what the rules are, what moral authority underpins those rules, and to whom they apply, when and where. We are seeing the de-universalization of international norms. We have seen the much diminished authority of great powers. We talk about living in an age of great power rivalry, but the paradox, the irony is that the great powers have never been weaker in their ability to impose their will on others or even persuade them, and they've never been weaker in terms of global problem solving. We are seeing the widespread denigration of multilateral institutions, a crisis of leadership, worse, I would say, than at any time since the 1930s. We live in a hyper-globalized world, but also one that is fragmenting. Amidst intensifying conflicts over ideology, identity, and culture. And of course, we live in an anarchic information space dominated by competing truths. And all this is happening when we in the world are facing enormous challenges, accelerating climate change, the aggravation of global poverty and inequality, the sharp escalation of great power confrontation, and of course, the devastating impact of the coronavirus. We live in an age of breakneck technological and informational transformation. And now we think, well, is someone ready to lead? Can someone lead the international community in addressing all these problems? Well, there should be a leader, but there isn't. Because I think US global leadership is over. Joe Biden can talk about America is back, but what does back mean? Does that back mean as a committed player on the international scene, or does he mean America is back to lead the world? Because unfortunately, America has neither the credibility, the capacity, nor the will to lead the world. And second, very few countries, including many of America's allies, look to Washington for global leadership. They want an active, committed, engaged America, but that is not the same thing as wishing to follow America. So while the United States remains the preeminent global power by just about every criterion you care to name, in general, power has become much more disaggregated and diffuse. And what this means is that there is no global leader nor global leaders. I'll leave it there.
Bobo, thanks so much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the recent controversy just in recent days about the new regional alliance in the Indo-Pacific between the US, UK, and Australia. You're a former Australian diplomat. You know all these countries very well. And what do you make of that? Was that an effort in Washington to change the channel, so to speak, from Afghanistan very quickly? Or is this showing us that, in fact, the strategic decisions will be made on a very regional basis, looking at specific geographic locations or specific issues? Partnerships will happen sort of in this ad hoc way, but sometimes, as we saw, leaving out key partners on in other areas or historic allies.
Well, I think you've answered your own question there. I think countries, including the United States, are taking an increasingly a la carte approach to multilateralism. So, for example, the Biden administration has gone down the route of caucusing in small groups or smaller groups of like-minded countries. And now the Quad is an example of this. AUKUS is another. But I actually think that that shift is not particularly new, because it seems to me that Biden is effectively following in the path, in the footsteps of George W. Bush's coalition of the willing. Because as in the Bush era, Washington's thinking appears to be that marshalling a larger international consensus is virtually impossible, and therefore the best option is to rally like-minded countries in support of US interests. So with AUKUS, I think the AUKUS controversy reveals several things. I think first it reveals that Biden, rather like Trump, will act in what he perceives to be America's best interests. And second, it shows that China is the all-consuming priority of the Biden administration. Now, for the UK, AUKUS is about global Britain. And why is global Britain important? Well, it's really about, in a sense, it's a Britain raging against the dying of the light. It's desperate to show that it still matters on the world stage. And AUKUS, and for example, gestures like sending the Queen Elizabeth carrier group to the Western Pacific, they're all part of reinforcing that message. Now, for Australia, as an Australian, AUKUS is about security in the deepest sense of the word. And that means binding the United States as closely to us as possible. Now, of course, upsetting the French is awkward, it's embarrassing, But the strategic and emotional rationale for favoring AUKUS was irresistible. Now, it seems to me that all the parties, Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, they underestimated the extent of the French reaction. But frankly, the bottom line is, I don't think they're that bothered. They believe that Paris will come around eventually, especially as China continues to push increasingly aggressively in the Indo-Pacific region.
And that's a perfect cue as we start to talk about France to turn to Daniela to come in with a bit of a European perspective here. There was a book review not too long ago in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung that said, had a nice line about how Russia can never be what it wants to be, and Germany doesn't want to be what it could be. The General McMaster talked about other countries have agency here, other capitals. We can include the EU as a world capital there. How and when, or will they ever take the agency that would seem to be theirs for the grabbing in this moment of chaos? Is Europe ready to step up? Is there more of a reason for Washington's snub of France than anybody wants to admit, that in fact the view is they won't? Daniela, please.
Thanks, David. Well, I would say Europe is trying, but not maybe trying at its best at the moment. So I think we've seen quite an evolution of the inner European debate of our own international role. And Donald Trump's presidency, of course, helped a great deal. He was the US president, which actually made Europeans take a major step on defense cooperation. However, if you look at it in substance, it doesn't make such a huge difference because it is still entirely the member states who provide the necessary capacities. However, I need to say that after Afghanistan and AUKUS over the past weeks, this debate has again gained pace. And what we see in Europe, and this has been around very traditionally for several decades, but more so over the past 3-4 years, as Europe has more intensely discussed the concept of strategic autonomy, that in particular France and Germany have two rather contrasted ideas of what this, defense cooperation in Europe might actually be. Germany has put a lot of effort together with the European Commission and others to start building structures for defense cooperation for the EU as a pillar or in addition to NATO. And if you listen to the French, their conclusion is far more, we don't need institutions, not really, not that much. We don't need large groups. Germany made sure we now have 25 member states in the structured defense cooperation called PESCO. The French rather look at smaller battle group style corporations, which can be, sent out swiftly and are very flexible. And I guess the truth is somewhere in the middle. Europe is now, I think, politically, much further towards the recognition that Europe has to build own capacity to act in the field of defense, in the broader field of security, and in other areas. And if we needed another wake-up call, it was definitely Afghanistan and AUKUS, but really the Trump presidency and the recognition that it is actually possible that the US revisits very substantively the security guarantees provided to Europe, which we were able to, for decades, to in a way lie back on. This has changed the debate. However, and that's, I think, very important to recognize, we are here speaking about the core of national sovereignty. So what we will not see in a long time is some kind of deep integration, but we will see, I hope, more structured, more strategic cooperation. And one important element that will be published or put forward this year, not all of it obviously will be published, but part of it maybe, the so-called strategic compass, which is really the base of any strategic reflection in the EU, because right now, member states, and they will continue to, still have very diverse risk assessments and very diverse view of the world, what matters. For the Baltic states and Poland, the top of list item would be obviously Russia. For Southern European member states, it would be North Africa. For France, it would probably be North Africa and terrorist threats coming from the Middle East, simply because of the own experience on French territory. And so the important first step really is to not, to level down those risk assessments, but to enhance the comprehension among Europeans, what everyone sees and what everyone wants to act upon, and then think much more strategically about the instruments that we need as Europeans to at least provide stability and, the necessary prerequisites in terms of security in our own neighborhood and for the EU.
It's interesting, as you describe those regional differences within the EU member states, the threats that they perceive, China doesn't come up, as opposed to where we see now the US being singularly focused. I mean, of course, it does come up, but China, it's not the primary.
No, China comes up a lot. I've been speaking now more about the more traditional, let's say, physical threats, but China is obviously a huge topic. And here again, the EU has moved forward. What is China for Europe? China is a partner, of course. It's an economic partner. And speaking to you from Berlin, I'm in the capital of the EU, where economic ties with China are, of course, very, very close, strategically built over years, and where it is very hard to suddenly shift gears and say, oh, China's not only a partner, but China is also a systemic competitor and maybe also an adversary. And of course, I mean, in terms of hybrid, if you talk hybrid in Europe, China has risen, for I would say 5-10 years back would have been Russia that had come top of list. Now China, which in some ways has more sophisticated ways of hybrid intervention, is there, of course, seen, discussed, and of course, preventive and protective measures are put into place. And then obviously China works in particular as an economic and political actor within the borders of the EU, trying to exert political influence, trying to prevent votes that displease Beijing in the EU, but also in the United Nations when it comes to human rights issues. And right now we very well know how, I would say, those vulnerabilities have been underestimated for quite a long while in the EU. And final point on China, I would say progress has been made not only in this area of protection, for instance, the Investment Screening Act that the EU now has, which has been translated into national laws, the new initiatives to counter the Belt and Road Initiative, in particular in the Eastern neighborhood and into Central Asia, all this is there. But what is now new and very recent is that the EU is also coming forward with an Indo-Pacific strategy, where China, of course, is the elephant in the room. And Germany, allied with other EU member states who have had their Indo-Pacific strategies out for a long time and have military presence, such as France or the UK. And Germany is now sending its first frigate, Bavaria, its name, to the Indo-Pacific. And this is, I mean, it may look symbolic, but it is an expression of, I would say, the beginning of a fundamental rethink, how we have to look at Asia and how we have to do more than just look at China.
But maybe I can ask you a question I was asking some of the EU leaders in New York last week, which is, if France had been invited, if any of Europe had been invited into this AUKUS proposal, should the EU have wanted in, or does the EU have a different notion of how to approach China policy, that in fact they might not want to be part of this, what seems to be a very confrontational policy, but to cut a different path that, as the European Council President Charles Michel suggested, maybe takes more of the economic relations into account? Of course, Washington might say the EU takes too much of the economic relationship into account.
Sorry, was that a question back to me?
That was back to you, Daniela. Yeah, if they should have, should they have wanted to be part of it? Then I have another one for General McMaster, and we'll come back right around.
Yeah, well, Europe definitely has a different approach than the US, and that's very clear. I mean, we have a different relationship with China, and hence the options that Europeans can and want to put on the table with regards to more confrontational approaches are different ones. And this is true both for the economic debate and the whole decoupling debate that in particular Trump really launched, and where Europe said, oh, wow, that we only have, we have something to lose here big time because of mutual investment, because of trade ties, and so on, and because of dependence on China in strategic points or very vulnerable points in our value chains, and with regards to the provision of important technologies and so on. So if Europe changes its approach towards China. This can, by definition, only go more slowly. And as I said, I think it has already started. And the COVID-19 crisis really accelerated this debate. The value chain discussion that we have right now, the provision of health products, really the list of what is critical industry has grown far longer. And Europeans think about their own provisions and that way about their own security in a much more holistic way. And when it comes to military presence, of course, I mean, European military presence compared to US military presence in the Indo-Pacific is far less developed. But there is also a far, I would say, bigger caution to even think about a bigger military presence, because I would say the concern about an escalation by those measures is more developed in Europe. And there is no, I don't know whether this exists in the US, but at least for Europe, I would say there's no real clarity on where we would actually go if China did cross red lines in the Indo-Pacific. What would we be ready to do militarily? Not sure the US is clear, but I would definitely say for the Europeans, there's not that much clarity that we should maybe have.
Well, thanks so much. I want to come back to General McMaster, because you made this point that 3 presidents have suggested that it wasn't worth it in Afghanistan. We know that whatever conclusions the American president of the moment makes, it's not for lack of great advice. Some of the best advice in the world comes to that desk where the tough decisions have to be made. You were in that role. And I wonder if you could share some thoughts with us about, given the strategic narcissism that you described, given the state of the world disorder that Bobo has described, what would you advise at this point? How does America reposition itself? What would you tell the current president or any president about where they should the directional shift that might be needed? And is there an issue of consistency where whatever you want to say about Russia over the long term, China over the long term, there's a certain direction that they stick the ground, whereas our system, the American political system, allows for a swinging of the pendulum, whether that's on JCPOA or whether that's on anything else, the ability to do and undo. What would be your prescription, if you could share with us shortly, or how do we get back on track?
Well, I mean, I don't think the presidents get the best advice a lot of times. I think a lot of presidents come into the job wanting to hear the advice that they would prefer, and I wrote a book about this, about how and why Vietnam became an American war. And when I was National Security Advisor, I was determined not to at least make the same mistakes. And on Afghanistan, we presented Donald Trump with his preferred option up front. This is what withdrawal from Afghanistan at any cost looks like. And in August of 2017, he made a much different decision than he made later, which was to begin the capitulation negotiations in 2019 that resulted in essentially a surrender agreement with a terrorist organization in February of 2020. President Biden doubled down on that. President Biden had said when he was vice president that he thought that the best military advice he was receiving was boxing in him as vice president and President Obama. Well, if you believe that, and you have tremendous confidence in your decisions, regardless of the analysis you receive, you make decisions like Donald Trump and like Joe Biden. And so I think that this is a failure of executive leadership. It's a failure of leadership overall to generate the will that's necessary. And I think this is relevant to Europe and the transatlantic relationship. And I'd just like to, I'll tell you, I mean, I'm listening to this conversation. I've got to tell you, I mean, I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but there's no such thing as an international community, right? It doesn't exist. Okay, we're talking about it and we're lamenting its demise, but it has never existed in human history. And until that we recognize that we are in a competitive international environment, and that with those who are, lamenting the loss of American leadership, ought to also recognize that there are actors in the world who are not waiting to be led by the United States. And therefore, we ought to put a higher premium on cooperation among like-minded nations who are bound together by common principles and values. And this is where I think Europe is lacking. I mean, we are lamenting, U.S. withdrawal from leadership in the world, and Germany doesn't even spend 1% of its GDP on defense, while the United States has committed to a European deterrence initiative where we rotate forces to the Baltic states. that the cost of which to the American taxpayer is like 33% of Germany's entire defense budget. Right? So when is Europe going to wake up? I mean, Europe talks about like strategic autonomy in a way that suggests some moral equivalence with the Chinese Communist Party, and then complains about the lack of U.S. leadership and consultation on issues. I mean, I think it's really astounding, the degree to which we are, I think, engaged in self-delusion about the nature of competitions, especially, I think, with China from an economic perspective. And already this discussion, like so many discussions, has framed this discussion about, like, gosh, Donald Trump was just so mean. And can you believe, how the China-U.S. rivalry has got us like caught in the middle, right? This is the narrative of Europe and strategic autonomy. Well, let's just consider what's happened since COVID-19. How about foisting a pandemic on the world, right? By suppressing news of human-to-human transmission, by bludgeoning and suppressing journalists and doctors who tried to ring the alarm bells. How about adding insult to injury with the wolf warrior diplomacy we've seen around the world? How about the physical aggression that we've seen with bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier? The building and weaponization of violence in the South China Sea, ramming and sinking vessels in the South China Sea. The threats to Taiwan, the violations of airspace against Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. How about really a massive campaign of cyber espionage against our medical research facilities in the midst of the pandemic? How about a campaign of economic coercion against Australia, and to kill one to kind of scare 100? So I'll tell you, I just don't think we're serious people. We're not competing, and we talk about these ideas of like the international community and the U.S. leaving leadership. Well, how about each of our countries, really stepping up a little bit and recognizing the nature of the threat of the Chinese Communist Party? And we are so self-referential, and Danielle made some great points here. But we're talking about how we are prioritizing decoupling. Are we not listening to Xi Jinping? Xi Jinping's agenda is decoupling, but he just wants to decouple on his own terms after extracting as much as he can out of the West to be in a position of preponderant power, not only across the Indo-Pacific, but internationally, and dominating supply chains and dominating advanced manufacturing and dominating the data-driven emerging global economy. So, I just don't think we deserve, to succeed here unless we wake up and begin competing and stop the self-referential, approach to the world.
I want to invite Bobo and Daniela to jump in at any point, but one thing you're saying is, as you speak, that I'm thinking of is, the international community is there for the taking. If the G7, the complaint.
No, it doesn't exist. It will never exist.
That they thought they had.
It will never exist.
On how to confront China in a unified way, and then the U.S. went on its own. And so this is the question. And I wonder, as Bobo jumps in, is NATO the biggest loser here? Because in fact, that of all the fictions, the one that is showing up to have perhaps the least teeth of all is that perhaps NATO. Bobo, you wanted to jump in. Go right ahead.
I'd like to pick up on a few points here. Look, I completely agree with General McMaster that this talk about international community is extremely unhelpful. I think one problem that we have when we discuss international relations is we use all these terms like rules-based international order, the free world, international community, or authoritarian model of governance. We throw around these labels, but we never really have a clear idea of what we mean by them. They've become platitudes, cliches, bromides, and we really need to sort of think about what do we want to achieve. Now, it seems to me that global governance is so lagging behind the demands placed in front of us and governance itself. And so that we really have to rethink the nature of global governance and the mechanisms of global order. Now, of course, this is going to be incredibly difficult. It's natural to lapse into fatalism and say, you know, we're doomed to this sort of mano a mano sort of confrontation between the United States and China. And that is important. But global order and disorder is so much more than just geopolitical competition. And we really should be prioritizing what I see as a 21st century global agenda, accelerating climate change, tackling rising poverty and inequality, technological transformation, global health, the information revolution, because these are the clear and present dangers of our time and also in coming decades. And they are vastly more relevant to the mass of humanity than great power geopolitics. Now, we need to get rid of the presumption of a natural born US global leadership. And I agree with General McMaster. It's so easy to lapse into self-referencing here. But we need to get real and rather than realist. It's time to dump the notion that the world revolves around great powers. There is zero future in some kind of great power arrangement. We are not living in 1815. We are not in Vienna. The world is vastly too complex. And it worries me that we focus so much. You know, we've gone from this extraordinary transformation. From 1989, we were saying, geopolitics doesn't matter. It's not important. The end of history, the end of geopolitics. That was rubbish then, but we're now going to the opposite extreme, like thinking that geopolitics is the clear consuming priority of our times. It is for many policymakers and thinkers, but it is not for most of humanity. And
but you often say that the problems are globalized, that there is a need for international cooperation, because I throw into there the question of how's going it alone working for the Brits, you know, where you are now. So just keep going. So explain, okay. So what is, I mean, if we believe General McMaster, and we do, that the global, this notion, it's a fiction, but you're saying there is a need for a strategy. What does that look like?
Okay. So if you're,
you know what? Hey guys, I think it looks like AUKUS, right? I mean, everybody's lament. I mean, it looks
but
like
that's Anglophone. That's
like-minded
English-speaking.
countries.
Only go with the allies that speak your language.
Why is AUKUS an issue? I mean, countries who share interests and have complementary capabilities come together to really cope with a well-defined problem of Chinese aggression, right? Why is that an issue? So, I mean, I just think it's really coalitions of like-minded countries who come together to really try to help solve problems. I mean, that's.
But not just. You see, I see the future of multilateralism as really a network of institutions and processes and mechanisms. So there will be the Quad, AUKUS, but there'll also be the UN Security Council. There'll be the ICAO. There'll be UNCLOS. There'll be the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There'll be ASEAN, the EU, NATO. It's, you know, we've got to be careful not to be overly prescriptive here. Really, I think there'll be many issues there'll be many organizations and mechanisms that will be issues and interests based rather than values driven. This is natural. This is the way of the world. But I just wanted to come back.
So hey, Bobo, hey, how about this though? How about World Health Organization? You mentioned ICAO. How about Human Rights Council, right? I mean, so this idea that there's a prize for membership in these organizations, I think, is kind of ludicrous, right? These international organizations are competitive spaces, and we've seen the Chinese Communist Party actually turn a lot of these organizations against their very purpose. And
You're absolutely right.
So I think it's important to recognize the competitive nature, which sounds like geopolitics to me, Bobo. You know what I mean?
It's not just, but my point
also
is
important to ask, where will the decisions be made and who will make them?
Different decisions will be made at different levels in different organizations. You see, there is no global hegemon anymore. There's not even a concert of great powers. Power, as I mentioned, has become much more disaggregated and diffuse. So different decisions will be made with different levels of effect. But, you know, General McMaster is right. We do live in a bitterly competitive an often confrontational world. But that does not mean that we cannot cooperate on certain issues. In a way, the EU sort of summation of their relationship with China, partly partner, partly competitor, partly systemic rival, is right. China is all those things. What worries me sometimes is that often we just have a one-dimensional view of China. We have a monolithic view of China. And we need to be I think, life is more complex. There are more variations. But I also wanted to pick up, if I may, just pick up one more point, that it's very easy for us to scapegoat Russia and China because so many of their actions have been utterly despicable and egregious, and I'm no way seeking to defend that. But it worries me that we are not taking a good hard look at our own suicidal statecraft. The fact is that we have, for the best part of 15 years, not practiced the values that we preach to others. The fact that our policy making, decision making has been so inept in so many areas, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, global financial crisis, COVID-19. The fact that we are seeing a hollowing out of liberal norms within our own societies, and therefore disenchantment with liberal values. These are fundamental problems. China and Russia have exploited our failings, but they did not create them in the first place.
But what I wanted to ask is, don't human beings crave leadership? General McMaster talked about presidents wanting to make the decision they wanted to make in the first place. Sometimes as a journalist, I complain that no matter what we write, the readers believe what they believed in the first place, only more so. And I want to let maybe Daniela jump in here, because don't human beings crave the steady hand of the general who is capable, the inspirational leader who's shown experience and wisdom? This is the week when we see Angela Merkel's successor, maybe kind of sort of having been chosen. Is there anyone out there that you three see who can lead the world's population in this direction of partnership to convince folks? Because in the end, they don't believe in the WHO or in NATO or in the UN Security Council. They turn to their leaders for the leadership that General McMaster said is so sorely lacking on this complex, disordered world stage. Maybe Daniela, do you have a thought? And jump in, Bobo and General, at any point.
It's of course always good to have clarity, to have a center of power and to know who's accountable, but the world is quite different at the moment. And if I speak to this from the European perspective, you see very different things happening at the same time. One is, of course, that some countries, and Bobo spoke about backsliding of democracy and liberal values. We see countries that are turning authoritarian within the borders of the European Union and questioning those fundamental values that the EU is based on, like Hungary, like Poland. So there you see an appetite, because those leaders have been re-elected already, for a strong and even authoritarian leadership, which is, of course, for the EU a problem. And that was, I think, what Bobo was aiming at. If we then have an ambition in leading change in neighboring countries or being a model region for others of the world that look at us. They still do, but we really have to be careful that we don't lose because of those internal developments. On a global scale, I mean, in my view, we very clearly have power competition, and Europe does sit in the middle. We see how other powers are trying to develop their influence within our own borders, and how they try with all kinds of means, and I spoke about hybrid earlier, build more influence in our neighborhood for political reasons, for economic interests, for many, many reasons. So I do think we live in an era of competition for influence. For some and between some, it is, in my view, fundamental systemic competition. And this plays out in areas, I mean, we have briefly touched upon a number of international institutions where this plays out. But I would say also it plays out greatly in the sphere of technology, where we really have to be, first of all, aware that technological leadership can be weaponized, and that we, and here I'm speaking about the political West and not only Europe, if we don't pay attention to the whole regulatory framework that we need to put in place so that technology doesn't undermine our principles of democracy and civil rights, for instance, I think then we really miss something. And that's where Europe comes in again for final thought, because I know we're running short of time. Europe has lost competitive edge as a former tech leader together with the US. And this is something that for strategic reasons is a big problem. And the question is, how do we catch up? And that's where we have to make a bet, because we definitely, in some ways, can work with China, but in others we simply can't. So the interest must be to find other partners who are like-minded, who share fundamental principles that we have. They may sit in Asia, but they sit in particular in the US. And that's where, and that will be my final point, really, because General McMaster asked, why is AUKUS a problem? Well, because from a European perspective, the French thought they had an agreement to build submarines. And if you suddenly realize not only can you not rely on contracts that you have signed, but you're not even informed early, but you basically learn it when everyone else learns it. That between allies is still, not the nicest thing to do.
Danielle, maybe
trust.
Danielle,
you're right, Danielle. We have one more minute.
Maybe that's what strategic autonomy looks like, Daniela. I mean, you can't have it both ways. Is what I'm saying. You can't have it both ways.
Last thought, Bobo.
Just part of the problem is with lack of leadership is that there is, as I mentioned, a crisis of leadership that's almost the worst in just about a century. But there's also a crisis of followership. No one wants to follow the leader. I mean, maybe Australia wants to follow the United States, but really beyond that, it's very hard to find countries that really want a leader. What they want to do is maximize their strategic autonomy and flexibility to the extent that that is possible. And I think most countries, most state actors aim for that.
Well, I love your point. I often tell readers, in governments that are truly of the people, by the people, for the people, we've really only got ourselves to blame. All of our panelists, thank you, Daniela Schwarzer, Bobo Lo, HR McMaster, to SIPA for a great kickoff to this fantastic forum.
I just got to say, I got to say one thing at the end here, right? This has been a downer. This has been a downer. But hey, would we trade places with 1938 or 1914? I don't think so. So I mean, I think we ought to maybe make a conscious effort to restore our confidence in what we have achieved, right? And not be so damn pessimistic, right?
Well, the thing is,
we actually do have agency.
Exactly. I wrote a piece called Masters of Our Fate earlier this year. I mean, we can give in to historical determinism and take a fatalistic attitude and just say, oh, it's all so hopeless. Or we can accept that the task, although extraordinarily difficult and complex and protracted, is still within our agency. And there, General McMaster and I are as one.
Well, thank you, everyone. You know it's a great conversation when no one wants it to end. So thanks, everybody, very much. On with this terrific SIPA forum. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.